Imagine for a second that you are the President of the United States. You wake up, grab your coffee, look at a map, and decide you want to buy the world's largest island. Sounds like a fever dream, right? Well, in 2019, it actually happened. But here is the twist. That wasn't the first time. The US has been trying to turn Greenland into the 51st state for nearly a century. Why? Because this isn't just a barren block of ice. It is the most valuable piece of real estate on Earth. We're talking about a land sitting on trillions of dollars of rare earth minerals, hiding top-secret nuclear waste from the Cold War under its glaciers, and holding enough fresh water to drown Miami if it melts. But behind the geopolitical chess game, there is a much darker reality. A reality of forced displacement, the world's highest suicide rates, and a native population fighting to survive a modernization that nearly destroyed them. Welcome to Greenland is not for sale, but the cost of living here is higher than you can imagine. 1. The $1 trillion real estate deal. Let's rewind the clock to August 2019. The world was already in a state of perpetual weirdness, but then a headline dropped that felt like it was ripped straight from a satire site. The Wall Street Journal reported that President Donald Trump was seriously looking into purchasing Greenland. At first, everyone thought it was a joke. I mean, come on, you don't just buy countries in the 21st century. This isn't the feudal era. You can't just slide into Denmark's DMs and Venmo them a few $1 trillion for a massive chunk of ice and rock. The internet immediately did what the internet does best. Within hours, Twitter was flooded with memes of a gold-plated Trump Tower photoshopped onto a bleak Arctic village. People joked about Greenland being the new 51st state and promised to make Greenland green again. It was hilarious. It was absurd. But then, the president doubled down. He confirmed it to reporters, calling it essentially a large real estate deal. He even cancelled a planned state visit to Denmark because the Danish Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen, called the idea absurd and firmly stated, Greenland is not for sale. Greenland is not Danish. Greenland belongs to Greenland. Talk about a diplomatic mic drop. But here is the thing that nobody was talking about while they were busy making memes. Trump wasn't actually crazy. I know. But stick with me. If you strip away the tweets and the diplomatic awkwardness, the idea of the United States buying Greenland is actually a geopolitical strategy that goes back nearly a century. This wasn't a random thought. It was a dusty file pulled from the Pentagon's basement. See, to understand why the US wants Greenland so badly, you have to look at a map, not the flat Mercator projection on your classroom wall that makes Greenland look the size of Africa. Spoiler, it's not. But a globe. Look at the world from the top down. If you are sitting in Moscow and you want to fire a nuclear missile at Washington, D.C., what is the shortest route? It's not across the Atlantic. It's right over the North Pole. Greenland is the gatekeeper of North America. It is the world's largest unsinkable aircraft carrier. If you control Greenland, you control the Arctic. And if you control the Arctic, you have a front row seat to the next major theatre of global conflict. This brings us to the year 1946. World War II had just ended. The dust was settling, Europe was in ruins, and the Cold War was just starting to freeze over. The United States realised that as technology advanced, the Atlantic Ocean wasn't enough of a buffer anymore. They needed a shield. Enter President Harry S. Truman. He wasn't tweeting about it. He was making moves in the shadows. In December 1946, at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York, US Secretary of State James Burns had a meeting with the Danish Foreign Minister Gustav Rasmussen. The mood was tense. Burns looked Rasmussen in the eye and made an offer that would make a Bond villain blush. The United States offered Denmark $100 million in gold bars to purchase Greenland. You heard that right. Not credit, not a wire transfer. Gold bullion. In today's money, that's roughly $1.4 billion. Imagine the scene. Grand ballrooms, cigar smoke, and a literal pile of gold on the table for an island 3 times the size of Texas. At the time, the offer made a terrifying amount of sense. During World War II, when Denmark was occupied by Nazi Germany, the US had basically taken over the defence of Greenland anyway, to stop the Nazis from setting up weather stations that could help them bomb Britain. We built bases, airfields and weather stations. We got comfortable. When the war ended, we didn't really want to leave. Secretary Burns basically told Rasmussen, "Look, Greenland is a giant ice cube that costs you a fortune to maintain. You're a small country recovering from a war. Take the gold, give us the keys, and we'll handle the polar bears. Rasmussen was reportedly shocked. He didn't want to go down in history as the man who sold a piece of the kingdom. It was a matter of national pride. Denmark politely but firmly declined the gold. But, and this is a huge but, they knew they couldn't defend the island alone. So as a consolation prize, they allowed the US to maintain a massive military presence there, which eventually led to the Thule air base. More on that horror show later. But let's go back even further. The 1946 offer wasn't even the first time. In 1867, the US State Department under William Seward, the same guy who bought Alaska from Russia for pennies on the acre, commissioned a report on the value of Greenland. Seward was a manifest destiny junkie. He saw a future where the United States controlled the entire northern hemisphere. He bought Alaska, and he had his eyes on Greenland and Iceland next. He wanted to encircle Canada and eventually force it to join the US. Yes, there was a time when the US plan was basically surround Canada until they give up. So, fast forward back to 2019. When Trump floated the idea, he was channeling the ghosts of Seward and Truman. But why now? Why the renewed interest? It's not just about missiles anymore, it's about the resource war. As the ice melts, and it is melting fast, which is a whole other existential crisis we will get to, the ground beneath is being revealed, and that ground is loaded. We are talking about arguably the largest deposits of rare earth metals outside of China: neodymium, praseodymium, dysprosium, stuff you can't pronounce but absolutely need for your iPhone, your Tesla, and your F-35 fighter jets. Currently, China controls about 70 to 80% of the global supply chain for these minerals. That is a massive chokehold on the Western economy. If China decides to turn off the tap, our tech sector goes dark. Greenland represents a way out. It's the backup plan. It's the strategic reserve. Buying Greenland wouldn't just be a real estate flex, it would be a checkmate in the trade war against China. Plus, there is the shipping angle. As the Arctic ice recedes, new shipping lanes are opening up. The Polar Silk Road could cut shipping times between Asia and Europe by weeks. Whoever owns the ports in Greenland owns the toll booth for the future of global trade. So, from a purely cold, calculated, risk-board perspective, buying Greenland is a genius move. It solves national defence, it secures critical resources, and it future-proofs the economy against a melting world. But here is where the logic falls apart. Here is where the real estate deal narrative turns dark. Greenland isn't just a territory. It isn't an empty parking lot waiting to be developed. It is home to 56,000 people. It has its own parliament, its own language, Cull, and a culture that has survived in the harshest environment on Earth for thousands of years. When the US talks about buying Greenland, or when Denmark talks about owning it, they are talking about the land, the rocks, and the strategic value. They rarely talk about the Inuit. For the people living there, this 2019 headline wasn't a funny meme. It was a reminder of a colonial nightmare they have been living in for centuries. It was a reminder that to the superpowers of the world, they are just tenants on a strategic asset. Imagine you are sitting in your living room in Nuuk, the capital city. You're watching the news and you see the President of the United States discussing your home like he's haggling for a used car. He's not talking about your culture, your struggle for independence, or the mental health crisis tearing your community apart. He's talking about square footage and mineral rights. This brings up the uncomfortable question. If the US had bought Greenland in 1946, or if the deal had gone through in 2019, what would have happened to the people? Would they have become US citizens? Would they have been displaced? Well, we don't have to guess. Because even without buying the country, the US military presence in Greenland has already left a scar that hasn't healed. We're going to peel back the layers of this ice sheet, and what's underneath isn't just gold and oil. It's radioactive waste, broken promises, and a history of human experimentation that sounds like fiction but is verified fact. The 2019 purchase offer was funny to the rest of the world, but for Greenland it was just another Tuesday in a centuries-long struggle to be seen as humans rather than coordinates on a map. And if you think the US government respects the sanctity of the ice, just wait until I tell you what they built inside the glacier in the 1960s. Trust me, it's not Santa's workshop. 2. Camp Century, the nuclear city under ice. If the idea of buying Greenland sounds like a plot from a political thriller, what I'm about to tell you next is straight out of a 1960s sci-fi horror movie. But unlike the movies, the radiation here is real, and the monster isn't an alien. It's a city buried under the ice that is slowly waking up. The year is 1959. The Cold War is freezing over, quite literally. The space race is heating up, but down on Earth, the US military is obsessed with finding new places to hide nukes where the Soviets can't find them. They look at the map, and they see the vast white nothingness of the Greenland ice sheet. To the average person, it looks like a frozen wasteland. To the Pentagon, it looked like the ultimate camouflage. Enter Camp Century. Now, if you were watching the newsreels back in 1960, you would have seen a very wholesome, very sciencey PR campaign. The US Army Corps of Engineers announced they were building a city under the ice to test construction techniques in polar environments and conduct climate research. It was marketed as a triumph of human engineering. Walter Cronkite even visited. They released documentaries showing smiling soldiers living in subterranean tunnels, getting haircuts, attending church services and doing science. It looked like an Arctic version of the Jetsons, a nuclear-powered utopia buried 30 feet beneath the surface of the glacier. But that was the cover story. The real reason Camp Century existed was a top-secret mission codenamed Project Iceworm. The plan was absolutely bonkers. The US wanted to build a massive network of 2,500 miles of tunnels under the Greenland ice cap. Inside these tunnels, they planned to deploy 600 Iceman nuclear missiles. These missiles would be mounted on trains that would constantly shuttle back and forth through the tunnels, making them impossible for the Soviets to target. If Moscow launched a strike, the US could pop up from the ice, like a whack-a-mole from hell, and retaliate instantly. Greenland was essentially going to become a subterranean nuclear-armed launch pad aimed directly at the Kremlin. And the kicker? They didn't really tell Denmark the full extent of this. Remember, Denmark had a nuclear-free zone policy. The US basically said, "Don't worry, it's just a research station," while silently wheeling in a portable nuclear reactor. Let's talk about the construction, because the engineering is actually mind-blowing. They used massive Swiss-made snow millers, imagine a snowblower the size of a semi-truck, to carve out deep trenches in the ice. Then, they covered these trenches with arched corrugated steel roofs and buried them back under the snow. Inside these insulated tubes, they built prefabricated wooden buildings. It was a fully functioning town. It had a library, a theatre, a hobby shop, a chapel, a hospital with an operating room, a laundromat, and a barber shop. It housed up to 200 soldiers at a time. Powering it all was the PM-2A, the world's first portable nuclear reactor. Imagine you're a soldier stationed there. You're living inside a glacier. The temperature in the tunnels is a steady -24°C, 11 degrees. But inside the heated prefabs, it's cozy. You wake up, grab breakfast, and go to work maintaining a nuclear reactor. You never see the sun. You never see the sky. You're essentially living in a submarine carved out of ice. But there was a problem, a big one. The engineers at the Pentagon, smart as they were, forgot one crucial rule of glaciology: ice flows. The Greenland ice sheet isn't a solid block of concrete. It's a slow-moving river of ice. As the years went by, the sheer weight of the ice above started to crush the tunnels. The walls began to warp, the floors buckled. The reactor room ceiling started to lower inch by inch. The city under the ice was being slowly digested by the glacier. By 1964, it became clear that Project Iceworm was doomed. The ice was moving too fast to maintain the train tracks for the missiles. The tunnels were becoming death traps. So what did the US Army do? They did what any bad tenant does when they trash an apartment. They packed up the expensive stuff and left the garbage behind. In 1967, Camp Century was officially abandoned. They removed the nuclear reactor core, thankfully, but they left almost everything else. And I mean everything. They left the buildings, the tunnels, the diesel fuel, the sewage, and, here is the scary part, about 200,000 litres of radioactive cooling water and tons of PCBs, toxic industrial chemicals. Why did they leave it? Because the scientists at the time assumed that the perpetual snow would just keep piling up. They figured Camp Century would be buried deeper and deeper, encased in ice forever, a frozen time capsule that would never see the light of day. The solution to pollution is dilution, or in this case deep freezing. It was the ultimate out-of-sight, out-of-mind strategy. But they didn't account for global warming. Fast. Forward to today. The Arctic is warming twice as fast as the rest of the planet. The Greenland ice sheet is melting at a rate that is terrifying climate scientists. And that perpetual snow that was supposed to bury Camp Century forever? It's starting to strip away. A 2016 study published in Geophysical Research Letters dropped a bombshell. It predicted that within the next 70 to 80 years, possibly sooner, the melt will reach the level of the camp. This means that Camp Century is going to be exhumed. The ice is going to vomit up the secrets of the Cold War. We're talking about a toxic cocktail of raw sewage, diesel fuel, PCBs, which cause cancer, and low-level radioactive waste flowing out of the glacier and into the ocean. This isn't just an environmental disaster, it's a diplomatic nightmare. Who is responsible for cleaning it up? The US says, hey, we built it with Denmark's permission, kind of, so it's your land, your problem. Denmark says, you built it, you clean it. Greenland says, you both used our land as a trash can, fix it. The local Inuit communities near the coast rely on the ocean for hunting and fishing. If that radioactive slurry hits the water, it poisons the food chain. It poisons the seals, the fish, and the people. It's the ultimate irony. The US built a base to protect against a nuclear war that never happened, but in doing so, they planted a slow-motion environmental nuclear bomb that is ticking down right now. When Trump, and now his 2025 administration, talks about buying Greenland, they're also buying this liability. They're buying a toxic waste dump that they created 60 years ago. It's like buying a house and realizing the previous owner, who was also you, buried a leaking oil tank in the backyard. This is the dark reality of the American footprint in Greenland. It's not just flags and treaties, it's physical, toxic waste, hidden under the pristine white snow, waiting for the sun to come out. And Camp Century isn't the only time the locals got the short end of the stick. If you think abandoning a base was bad, wait until you hear about what happened when the US decided to build a base and realized there were people living in the way. Spoiler alert, they didn't ask them to move politely. They gave them 4 days. Hey, quick pause. If you're enjoying this dive into the classified history of the Arctic, hit that subscribe button. We're going to cover 13 more dark realities, and trust me, the experiment children story coming up will make your blood boil. Also, let me know in the comments, if you were the president, would you spend billions to clean up this radioactive mess, or leave it for Denmark? Let's argue in the comments. 3. The suicide capital of the world. If you look at a brochure for Greenland, you see pristine white glaciers, colourful wooden houses popping against the snow, and smiling children in traditional Inuit anoraks. It looks peaceful. It looks like the last untouched place on Earth. But there is a statistic that you won't find in the travel guides. It is a number that haunts every family, every village, and every politician in the country. Greenland has the highest suicide rate in the world, and it's not even close. To give you some context, the global average suicide rate is roughly 10 per 100,000 people. In the United States, which has its own mental health crisis, it's about 14. In Greenland, the rate consistently hovers between 80 and 100 per 100,000 people. In some remote villages in East Greenland, that rate can skyrocket to over 400. Think about that for a second. That is nearly 10 times the global average. There is almost no one in Greenland who hasn't been to a funeral for someone who took their own life. It is a national trauma that hangs over the island like a permanent fog. Now, the lazy explanation, the one you might hear at dinner party is, oh, it must be the weather. It's the dark winters, right? Seasonal affective disorder. It makes sense intuitively. If you live in a place where the sun doesn't rise for months at a time, you'd assume depression would spike. But here is the chilling twist. Suicide rates in Greenland don't peak in the dark of winter. They peak in the summer. They peak in June when the sun never sets. The midnight sun might look beautiful on Instagram, but biologically it can be torture. Imagine trying to sleep when it is bright daylight at 3 a.m. For weeks. Your circadian rhythm shatters. You enter a state of constant, exhausted mania. The insomnia amplifies anxiety, and the lack of darkness means there is literally nowhere to hide from your own thoughts. But biology is only a tiny fraction of the story. If it were just the weather, the rates would have been high for thousands of years. But they weren't. If you go back to the early 20th century, suicide in Greenland was incredibly rare. Anthropologists and explorers noted that the Inuit were remarkably resilient, characterized by a pragmatic, often humorous outlook on life despite the brutal environment. The explosion in suicide didn't start until the 1960s and 70s, and that timing is the key to understanding the dark reality. This crisis isn't about snow, it's about post-colonial stress disorder. In 1953, Greenland's status changed from a colony to a county of Denmark. Copenhagen decided it was time to modernise the island. They looked at the Inuit, who were living in small scattered settlements, hunting seals and living off the land, and said, "We need to fix this." They implemented the G60 policy, which we will dive deeper into later. In short, they closed down dozens of small settlements and forcibly relocated thousands of people into concrete apartment blocks in larger towns like Nuuk. Imagine you are a hunter. Your entire identity, your worth as a man, your connection to your ancestors is tied to your ability to read the ice, navigate the fjords, and provide food for your family. You're the master of your environment. Then, overnight, the government tells you that your village is being shut down. They move you into a cramped apartment in a Soviet-style concrete block 500 miles away. You can't hunt there, there is no ice to read, there are no seals. Suddenly you are unemployed. You don't speak Danish well, which is the language of the administration. You are on welfare. You've gone from being a proud provider to a dependent on the state. Your skills are obsolete. Your identity is erased. This created a generation of broken men, and that trauma trickled down. The children of that generation, the ones born in the 70s, 80s and 90s, inherited a world of rootlessness. They grew up in homes plagued by the alcoholism that their parents used to numb the pain of displacement. They grew up in a culture that was being told it wasn't good enough, unless it became Danish. Today, the group most at risk is young men aged 15 to 24. These are kids who are connected to the internet, seeing the rest of the world, but feeling trapped in isolated communities where opportunities are scarce. And let's talk about the isolation. In the US or Europe, if you are having a mental health crisis, you can, hopefully, drive to a hospital or call a specialist. In Greenland, if you live in a remote settlement like Inuit, the nearest doctor might be a helicopter ride away. And that helicopter doesn't fly if the weather is bad. There is a severe shortage of psychologists and psychiatrists who speak Kalaallisut, Greenlandic. Imagine trying to articulate your deepest, darkest trauma to a therapist who only speaks a second language, or having to use a translator. The barrier to getting help is massive. Then there is the contagion effect. In small towns of 200 or 300 people, everyone knows everyone. When one young person takes their life, it sends a shockwave through the peer group. It breaks a taboo. It becomes a tragic option that others consider. We have seen suicide clusters where a single village will lose multiple teenagers in a single month. It destroys the fabric of the community. The government is trying. They have set up hotlines. They're training gatekeepers in villages to spot the signs, and they are trying to revive cultural pride. There is a massive movement now to reclaim Inuit identity, tattooing, drum dancing, language revitalization. It's about telling these kids, you come from survivors, you're strong. But the statistics are stubborn. This is the shadow that hangs over the real estate deal. When foreign powers talk about Greenland, they talk about it as a strategic asset. They want the ports, they want the zinc, they want the uranium, but they rarely ask, what happens to the people who are already at the breaking point? If the US or China were to pour billions into industrializing Greenland, building massive mines and new cities, would that bring prosperity? Or would it be another wave of rapid, forced modernization that shatters the culture all over again? Would an influx of foreign workers and easy money fix the despair? Or would it just add fuel to the fire of alcoholism and alienation? The suicide crisis is a stark reminder that you cannot just engineer a society from the top down without consequences. You cannot strip away a people's purpose and expect them to be okay. When you look at those beautiful pictures of Nuuk with the northern lights dancing overhead, remember that inside those illuminated windows, there is a battle being fought that is far more desperate than any geopolitical squabble. It is a battle for the will to live. And speaking of battles for the future, there is one specific mountain in South Greenland that has become the literal battleground for the 21st century. It's not about ice, and it's not about fish. It's about the metal inside your smartphone. Let's head to Kvanefjeld, where the green revolution is colliding headfirst with the radioactive reality of the Arctic. For rare earths and the new Cold War. If you drive about 6 miles north of the quiet town of Narsak in southern Greenland, you will see a mountain. To the untrained eye, it looks like just another jagged grey peak in a land full of them. But to the superpowers of the world, this mountain, Kvanefjeld, or Quanasut in Greenlandic, looks like a bank vault that has been left wide open. This isn't just a mountain, it is arguably the world's largest undeveloped deposit of rare earth elements. We are talking about millions of tons of neodymium, dysprosium and terbium. If those names sound like made-up elements from a Marvel movie, here is why you should care. You cannot build the 21st century without them. You want an electric vehicle? You need these metals for the magnets in the motor? You want a wind turbine to save the planet? You need Kvanefjeld. You want an F-35 fighter jet to lock onto a target? You need Kvanefjeld. For decades this mountain sat undisturbed, but in the last few years, it has become ground zero for a new Cold War. And this time, the enemy isn't the Soviet Union. It's a supply chain. Here is the dark reality that keeps Pentagon generals awake at night. China currently controls about 90% of the processing capacity for these minerals. They hold the keys to the digital age. If Beijing decides to embargo rare earths, which they have threatened to do, the Western tech sector grinds to a halt. So, naturally, the West looked at Greenland and said, "Great, we'll just dig up Kvanefjeld and break the Chinese monopoly." But there was a plot twist. When Western investors looked closer at the company holding the mining license, Greenland Minerals, they found a wolf in sheep's clothing. The company is Australian-based, sure, but its largest shareholder and strategic partner is a company called Shenghe Resources. And who owns Shenghe Resources? It's a Chinese company with deep ties to the state, so even if we dig up our mountain to escape China's grip, the ore was contractually obligated to be shipped to China for processing anyway. We were trying to escape the trap, only to find out the trap was already inside the house. This kicked off a massive geopolitical panic. But while the US and China were playing 4D chess over who gets the rocks, the actual people living at the foot of the mountain had a different problem: uranium. You see, Kvanefjeld is a polymetallic deposit. The rare earths are mixed together with massive amounts of uranium. You can't get the good stuff without digging up the radioactive stuff. The people of Narsak, a farming community that produces most of Greenland's lamb and vegetables, were terrified. They were told that the mine would create a dust cloud of radioactive tailings that could settle on their pastures, poison their water, and destroy their way of life. This led to the most dramatic election in Greenland's history. In 2021, the Inuit Ataqatigiit IA Party, A, ran on a single hardline promise: no uranium mining, and they won. One of their first acts in power was to pass Act No. 20, which banned the mining of any ore with a uranium content higher than 100 parts per million. Since Kvanefjeld is way above that limit, the project was effectively dead. The locals celebrated, the environment was saved, but the story didn't end there. In fact, it just got darker. The mining company didn't pack up and leave. They sued. They slapped the governments of Greenland and Denmark with an $11.5 billion lawsuit. To put that number in perspective, Greenland's entire annual GDP is about $3 billion. The company is suing them for nearly 4 times the size of their entire economy. It's a corporate death threat. It sends a message: let us mine, or we will bankrupt your entire country. And now, with President Trump back in the White House as of 2025, the pressure cooker is exploding. The Trump administration views the ban not as an environmental victory, but as a strategic failure. There are reports that US diplomats are pressuring Greenland to find a legal workaround to lift the ban. They want those minerals, and they want them now. So Greenland is trapped in a vice. On one side, you have China, which already has its hooks in the company. On the other side, you have the US, desperate to secure the minerals for national defense. And in the middle, you have 56,000 people who just want clean water and safe food, facing a lawsuit that could turn their country into a debtor's prison. It is the ultimate paradox of the green transition. To save the world from climate change with EVs and wind turbines, we are demanding that indigenous people in the Arctic let us blow up their radioactive mountain. Kvanefjeld isn't just a mine, it's a hostage situation. And speaking of hostages, let's talk about the time the US military took an entire tribe of people, gave them 4 days to pack their bags, and kicked them into the desolate north so they could build a radar station. This is the story of Thule, and it is a national scar that has never healed. 5. Thule Air Base, the forced displacement. If you own a globe, spin it around and put your finger on the very top of the world. Now slide it down just a little bit along the northwest coast of Greenland. You'll find a spot that looks like the absolute end of the inhabited world. This is the home of the Inuit. They are the northernmost indigenous people on Earth. For over 4,000 years, they survived in conditions that would kill the rest of us in about 20 minutes. They lived in a settlement called Umanak, not to be confused with the other town of the same name. To them, this wasn't just a frozen shoreline, it was the heart of the world. The hunting was abundant. Walrus, narwhal, polar bear. The location was perfect. The cliffs protected them from the biting Arctic winds. But in the early 1950s, the US Air Force looked at that same map, pointed at that same perfect location, and said, "That looks like a great spot for a radar station." You see, in the paranoia of the Cold War, the shortest route for a Soviet bomber to reach New York was right over the North Pole. The US needed a listening post. They needed a shield. And thanks to the 1951 Defence of Greenland Treaty with Denmark, they had the green light to build it. They called it Thule Air Base. At first, the Americans and the Inuit lived side by side. It was a weird, surreal coexistence. You had Stone Age hunters who used kayaks and harpoons living next door to guys named Chad from Ohio who were fixing jet engines and drinking Coca-Cola. There are stories of locals trading fox furs for cigarettes and chocolate. It was a clash of civilizations, but it was peaceful. But then, the base needed to grow. The US decided to install a massive Nike Hercules anti-aircraft missile battery. They needed more space. And more importantly, they didn't want civilians getting too close to their top-secret toys. So, in May 1953, the hammer dropped. The Danish authorities, acting on behalf of their American allies, walked into the village of Umanak and delivered an ultimatum that remains one of the darkest stains on Danish Greenlandic history. They told the Inuit, "You have to leave. Now." They weren't given months to plan. They weren't offered comfortable resettlement packages. They were given 3 to 4 days. And I want you to really picture this scene. We aren't talking about moving from Brooklyn to Jersey. We are talking about moving an entire community across the high Arctic sea ice. On May 25, 1953, 116 people, men, women, children and elders, packed everything they owned onto dog sleds. They looked back at their ancestral homes, the graves of their loved ones, and the only land they had ever known, and they started mushing north. They travelled 130 kilometres, about 80 miles, across the frozen ocean to a place called Qaanaaq. The journey was brutal, it was freezing, the ice was treacherous, and when they finally arrived at Qaanaaq, guess what they found? Nothing. There were no houses waiting for them. There was no infrastructure. The town they were promised was a barren, windswept slope. The Danish government had pitched a few tents. That was it. These people, who had lived in warm, semi-subterranean turf houses that had been perfected over millennia, were now living in canvas tents on the frozen ground. In the Arctic. And to add insult to injury, the location was terrible. Qaanaaq is much windier than their old home. The sea currents are different, making hunting more dangerous. The heart of the world had been replaced by a government-mandated refugee camp. For decades, the Danish government lied about this. They officially called it a voluntary relocation. They claimed the Inuit wanted to move because they were annoyed by the noise of the airplanes. They spun a narrative that the locals had practically begged to leave their perfect hunting grounds for a windy tent city. It wasn't until nearly 50 years later, in 1999, that the Danish High Court finally ruled that the relocation was an unlawful expropriation. The survivors were awarded compensation. Do you want to know how much? About $4,300 each. $4,300 for losing your home, your land, and your way of life. That's less than the cost of one of the tyres on the jets that replaced them. But wait, it gets worse. Because Thule Air Base wasn't done traumatizing these people. 15 years after the forced relocation, on January 23, 1968, a B-52 bomber carrying 4 hydrogen bombs caught fire while flying over Thule. The crew bailed out and the plane crashed onto the sea ice in North Star Bay, right near where the Inuit used to hunt. The conventional explosives in the bombs detonated on impact. They didn't trigger a nuclear explosion, thank God, but they shattered the radioactive cores. The crash site was contaminated with plutonium, uranium and americium. It was a radioactive nightmare. The US and Denmark launched a massive cleanup operation called Project Crested Ice. They scraped up the contaminated snow and shipped it back to the US. But you can't get everything. Millions of litres of radioactive water were left behind. The seabed was contaminated. The local hunters, who had already been kicked off their land, now had to wonder if the seals and walruses they were eating in their new home were radioactive. There were reports for years of strange illnesses, hair loss, and cancer among the Thule workers and the local population. It was a broken arrow incident, a military term for a nuclear accident that broke the trust of the people forever. This is the context you need to understand when you see headlines about the US wanting to buy Greenland. To the Inuit, the US military isn't a protector. It's a landlord from hell. It's a force that shows up, takes the best land, kicks you out into the snow, drops 4 nukes on your front porch, cleans up most of it, and then hands you a check for $4,000 50 years later. The existence of Thule Air Base is the elephant in the room of Greenlandic independence. It is a sovereign piece of America on Greenlandic soil. It operates under its own rules. And here is the kicker. The base is critical to the local economy today. It pays the airport fees. It employs locals. The contract for servicing the base is worth hundreds of millions of dollars. So Greenland is in an abusive relationship with the base. They hate the history of how it got there. They fear the environmental damage it caused, but they need the money it brings to survive. They are trapped. And speaking of traps, the Danish government didn't just try to manage the land of Greenland. In the 1950s, they decided the problem wasn't just where the Inuit lived, but who they were. They decided to launch a social experiment to fix the Inuit culture by erasing it completely. Get ready, because the next part is going to make you look at the Scandinavian social utopia model in a very different light. 6. The Danish experiment, cultural erasure. If you thought the forced relocation of the Thule Inuit was a one-off military blunder, I have some bad news. It was actually just a rehearsal for something much bigger, much more systematic, and frankly, much more terrifying. Welcome to the 1950s and 60s. The world was modernising, the space age was starting, and in Copenhagen the Danish government looked at their newly upgraded county of Greenland and decided it was essentially a fixer-upper. They looked at the Inuit way of life, small scattered settlements, hunting seals, living in turf houses, speaking a language that had zero relation to any European tongue, and they saw a problem. They didn't see a resilient culture that had mastered the Arctic. They saw backwardness. They saw poverty. They saw a people that needed to be saved from themselves. So they came up with a plan, a master plan. They called it G60. It sounds like a summit for world leaders, but it was actually a social engineering program that would make a Soviet planner blush. The goal was simple, de-Greenlandization, or, as they politely called it, Danification. The logic went like this. If Greenland is going to be part of the modern world, Greenlanders need to stop being hunters and start being factory workers. They need to stop speaking Kalaallisut and start speaking Danish. They need to stop living in primitive villages and start living in civilized towns. They wanted to take a Stone Age culture and drag it into the Jet Age in a single generation. The Great Shutdown Step 1 was the concentration policy. Yes, that's literally what they called it. Koncentrationspolitikken. The Danish government decided that it was too expensive to provide schools, hospitals and electricity to hundreds of tiny remote settlements scattered across thousands of miles of coastline. So they decided to just shut them down. Imagine you are living in a small village called Kulisat. It's a coal mining town. It's prosperous. You have a community. You have a soccer team. You have a home. Then the government announces that your town is unprofitable. They cut the power. They close the store. They stop the ships from coming. You're given a choice. Stay here and freeze in the dark or move to the designated growth centres like Nuuk, Pamut or Sissimut. It wasn't a choice. It was an eviction notice for an entire culture. Between 1960 and 1975, thousands of people were uprooted. They left behind the graves of their ancestors. They left behind the only world they knew. They watched their homes be bulldozed or simply abandoned to the elements. The concrete trap. So, where did they go? They didn't move into cosy suburban houses with white picket fences. They were moved into massive brutalist concrete apartment blocks that looked like they were airlifted straight from East Berlin. The most infamous of these was Block P in Nuuk. Block P was a monster. At its peak, this single building housed 1% of the entire population of Greenland. Think about that. Imagine if 1% of the entire US population lived in one building. That's 3.3 million people in a single megastructure. For the Inuit hunters who were moved there, Block P was a prison. These were men used to the infinite horizon of the sea ice. They were used to silence. Now, they were crammed into tiny shoebox apartments with thin walls, surrounded by the noise of hundreds of neighbours. The architects, in their infinite wisdom, designed the apartments based on Danish standards. The doorways were too narrow for people wearing thick Arctic furs to walk through comfortably. The closets were too small to store hunting gear, and here is the most heartbreaking detail: the bathtubs. The apartments had modern bathtubs, which the Danes thought was a great luxury. But the Inuit hunters didn't use them for bubble baths, they used them to butcher seals. Imagine dragging a bloody seal carcass up 3 flights of concrete stairs because you have nowhere else to prepare your food. The drains would clog with blubber and fur. The neighbours would complain about the smell. The clash between the civilized architecture and the reality of Arctic life was violent and humiliating. But the Danification wasn't just about where you lived. It was about who you were. In 1964, the Danish government passed a law that officially codified discrimination. It was called the Birthplace Criterion, Fødesteds Kriteriet. The law stated that if you were born in Greenland, you would be paid significantly less than someone born in Denmark for doing the exact same job. Let's say you were a Greenlandic teacher working in Nuuk. You grew up there, you speak the language, you know the kids. Your colleague is a Danish teacher who just arrived from Copenhagen and doesn't speak a word of Greenlandic. Under this law, the Danish teacher would earn roughly 15% to 40% more than you. Plus, they got free annual trips back to Denmark and better housing. The message was clear: you are second-class citizens in your own country. This law destroyed the Greenlandic psyche. It told an entire generation that no matter how hard they worked, no matter how much they modernized, they would never be equal to a real Dane. It bred resentment that is still alive and kicking today. It told them their labour was worth less simply because of their ethnicity. Then there was the school system. The G60 policy decided that the Greenlandic language was a barrier to progress. So they flooded the schools with Danish teachers. In many classrooms, speaking Greenlandic was forbidden or strongly discouraged. Children were taught that their native tongue was the language of the past, a peasant dialect that had no place in the modern world. If you wanted to be smart, if you wanted to be successful, you spoke Danish. This created a linguistic divide that tore families apart. You had grandparents who only spoke Greenlandic, and grandchildren who were being forced to speak only Danish. Suddenly they couldn't communicate. The transmission of oral history, the stories, the myths, the hunting techniques that had been passed down for 4,000 years, was severed. It was cultural lobotomy. The result of the G60 policy wasn't a modern, happy Denmark of the North. It was a social catastrophe. Stripped of their hunting grounds, their independence, and their dignity, many men turned to the bottle. Alcoholism exploded, violence skyrocketed, and as we discussed earlier, the suicide rates began their tragic climb. The growth centres like Nuuk became pressure cookers of trauma. You had thousands of people who were grieving the loss of their homes, jammed together in concrete slums dependent on welfare checks from the very government that put them there. It is important to understand that the Danes who implemented these policies weren't trying to be evil. They genuinely thought they were helping. They looked at the tuberculosis rates in the turf houses and thought, we must get them into warm apartments. They looked at the harsh life of a hunter and thought, we must get them factory jobs. But they made the fatal mistake of assuming that progress looks the same for everyone. They assumed that becoming more Danish was the only way to be a successful human being. They failed to realise that by destroying the culture, they were destroying the people. Today, Block P has been demolished. It was torn down in 2012, and the rubble was used to build roads. But the psychological rubble of the G60 policy is still there. Every time a politician in Copenhagen complains about the cost of subsidising Greenland, the locals remember why they are dependent in the first place. They remember who destroyed their self-sufficiency. And if you think this broad social engineering was bad, wait until you hear about the specific targeted experiment that took place in 1951. While G60 was about moving the masses, this next story is about stealing the children. The Danish government decided that Danification was taking too long, so they decided to speed it up by taking 22 of the smartest, healthiest Inuit children away from their families and shipping them to Denmark to be reprogrammed. They called them the experiment children. You will call it a crime against humanity. 7. The little Danish experiment, the experiment children. If you thought the G60 policy was cold, Calculate what I'm about to tell you next. This isn't a statistic. This is the story of stolen childhoods. The year is 1951. We're on the dock in Nuuk, the capital of Greenland. A ship called the Emps Disco is preparing to depart for Copenhagen. On the deck, waving goodbye to their weeping parents, are 22 children. They are small, between 6 and 10 years old. They are dressed in their finest clothes. They look confused, but they have been told they are going on a grand adventure. They have been told they are special. These 22 kids were the subjects of one of the most heartless social experiments in modern history. They are known today as the Experiment Children, Experiment Børnene. Here was the plan, cooked up by the Danish colonial administration, and endorsed by charities like Save the Children. Yes, ironically. Denmark wanted to modernise Greenland, right? But they felt the Greenlanders were too Greenlandic. They believed the culture was holding them back, so they decided to create a new elite class of Inuit. They went into the villages and handpicked the smartest, healthiest and most promising children. They convinced the parents, often widows or poor families, that this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. They told them, "Give us your children. We will take them to Denmark, teach them Danish, educate them, and turn them into little Danes. Then we will bring them back, and they will be the leaders who guide Greenland into the future." It was sold as a golden ticket. In reality, it was a kidnapping sanctioned by the state. The ship sailed. The children arrived in Denmark, a land of trees and trains they had never seen before. But instead of going to warm homes, they were immediately sent to a holiday camp called Fedgarden for quarantine. They were isolated, and the first rule of the camp was brutal: no Greenlandic. If they spoke their mother tongue, they were scolded or punished. They were forced to speak Danish. They were stripped of their traditional clothes and put in European outfits. They were being scrubbed clean of their identity. After the quarantine, they were placed with Danish foster families for over a year. They went to Danish schools, they learned about Danish history, they forgot the smell of seal blubber and the sound of the wind on the ice. They forgot their own language. Then, in 1952, the experiment was declared a success. The children were fluent in Danish. They were civilized. It was time to send them back to Greenland to lead their people. But here is the twist that makes this story truly horrific. When the ship arrived back in Nuuk, the parents were waiting on the dock. They were overjoyed. They rushed to hug their children, speaking to them in Greenlandic, asking them about the trip. The children just stared at them. They couldn't understand a word. They couldn't speak to their own mothers. The language barrier was absolute. And then came the second blow. The children weren't allowed to go home. The Danish administrators decided that if these little Danes went back to their primitive families, they would lose their polish. They would revert to being Inuit. So, the children were taken from the dock and marched directly into a red brick building in Nuuk. It was an orphanage run by the Danish Red Cross. These children, who had living parents just a few miles away, were forced to live in an institution. They were forbidden from playing with regular Greenlandic kids. They were kept apart like a rare species in a zoo. Imagine the psychological torture. You're 7 years old. You can see your mother through the window, but you can't live with her. You can't talk to her. You're trapped in a limbo between two worlds, belonging to neither. They were mocked by the local Greenlandic kids for being too Danish and wearing fancy clothes. They were looked down upon by the Danes for being Inuit. They were isolated, lonely and confused. One of the survivors, Helen Thiessen, has told her story in heartbreaking detail. She remembers crying herself to sleep, wondering why her mother didn't want her. She didn't know that her mother was fighting to get her back, but was blocked by the colonial administration. The experiment was a catastrophic failure. These children didn't become the new elite, they became broken. Adults, the trauma of being ripped from their roots, re-engineered, and then abandoned in an orphanage destroyed them. Many of them struggled with severe mental health issues their entire lives. They faced alcoholism, depression, and a profound loss of identity. Of the original 22 children, half of them died young, some by suicide, some by substance abuse. They were the casualties of a government that thought it could play God with human souls. For decades, this story was buried. The Danish government pretended it never happened. It wasn't until 1998 that a Danish author found the documents in the archives and broke the story. The survivors, now in their 50s and 60s, finally learned the truth. They weren't orphans, they were lab rats. In 2020, Just a few years ago, the Danish Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen, finally offered an official apology. She met with the 6 surviving members of the group. "We cannot change what happened," she said, "but we can take responsibility for it." The survivors sued the Danish state for compensation and won. But no amount of money can buy back a childhood. No check can replace the years of silence between a mother and her child. This story matters today because it explains the deep, visceral anger you see in Greenland when foreign powers try to intervene. When President Trump or any other world leader talks about helping Greenland or developing it, the Greenlandic people hear the echoes of 1951. They hear, "We know what's best for you better than you do." They remember that the last time a foreign power tried to improve them, it cost them their children. This deep-seated mistrust is the bedrock of Greenlandic politics. You can't buy their loyalty with gold bars or investments because they know the hidden cost of assimilation. And the trauma of displacement didn't end with the children. As we touched on before, the housing policies of the 1960s created physical environments that were just as damaging as the social ones. We talked about Block P, but we need to go deeper into the housing nightmare that followed. Because when you take a nomad and put him in a concrete box, you don't just change his address, you break his spirit. Let's step inside the concrete jungle of the Arctic. 8. The concrete blocks, a housing nightmare. If you stood in the centre of Nuuk, Greenland, in the 1970s, you would have seen something that made absolutely no sense. You would be surrounded by the wildest nature on Earth. Jagged, snow-capped mountains, vast fjords filled with icebergs, and a sky so clear it looks like it was painted in high definition. And then, right in the middle of this Arctic paradise, your eyes would land on a building that looked like it was teleported from a dystopian Soviet industrial park. It was a massive grey concrete slab. It was 200 metres long, about 650 feet, and 5 stories high. It cut through the landscape like a scar. This was Block P. Now, every country has bad architecture, but Block P wasn't just an ugly building, it was a mathematical tragedy. At its peak, this single structure housed 1% of the entire population of Greenland. I want you to really visualize that statistic. Imagine if you took 3.3 million Americans, the entire population of Los Angeles, and shoved them all into one single apartment complex. That is the scale of social condensation we are talking about. Block P was the crown jewel of the G60 policy we talked about earlier. It was the physical manifestation of Denmark's attempt to urbanize the Inuit. They looked at the small, colourful wooden houses that dotted the coast, homes that were easy to heat, easy to repair, and perfectly adapted to the landscape, and they said, "No, this is too primitive. We need to build modern." So they flew in architects from Copenhagen who had never lived in the Arctic. These architects looked at their blueprints and said, "Let's build standard Danish apartments." The result was a disaster of epic proportions. Let's walk through the front door of a Block P apartment in 1970. You're a hunter who has just been relocated from a small settlement in the north. You are used to silence, you're used to space. First you notice the door, it's narrow, it's a standard European width, but you are wearing heavy sealskin furs and thick kamiks, boots, because it's 20 degrees outside. You have to squeeze sideways just to get into your own home. Then, you look for a place to put your gear. You have Sled dog harnesses, thick parkas, fishing nets, and maybe a rifle. But the hallway closet is tiny. It was designed for light Danish trench coats and umbrellas, not Arctic survival gear. So, where do you put your stuff? You pile it on the balcony. But wait, the balcony is also the fire escape route. So now, the entire building is a fire hazard because the emergency exits are blocked by sleds and nets. Then comes the kitchen. It's small, it has an electric stove, but you don't buy your meat in plastic-wrapped packages from a supermarket. You hunt it. You have a 200-pound seal that you need to butcher. Where do you do it? There is no space in the kitchen, so you drag the seal into the bathroom. You put it in the bathtub, you start butchering it there. The architects in Copenhagen never anticipated that tenants would be gutting marine mammals in the bathtubs. The drains weren't designed for blubber, thick blood, and fur. They clogged immediately. The plumbing system of Block P became a nightmare. The pipes were constantly backing up. The smell of rotting meat and sewage would waft through the ventilation shafts, permeating the entire building. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the psychological torture. In a traditional Inuit settlement, conflict was handled by avoidance. If you had a problem with someone, you just moved your tent or your house further away. You respected each other's silence. In Block P, you had thin concrete walls. You could hear your neighbour arguing. You could hear them crying. You could hear them drinking. There was no escape. This sudden density created a pressure cooker. The hallways of Block P became notorious for violence. The stairs were often unsafe at night. The building became a symbol of everything that was going wrong with the modernisation project. It was a vertical ghetto where the trauma of displacement festered, and it wasn't just Block P. This concrete block strategy was rolled out across all the major towns: Pammut, Maniitsoq, Sisimiut. The landscape of Greenland was dotted with these grey monoliths, standing like tombstones for the villages that had been destroyed. But the housing nightmare had another layer, one that hit people in their wallets and their pride. Remember the birthplace criterion I mentioned? The law that paid Danes more than Greenlanders? Well, it applied to housing too. If you were a sent-out Dane, someone hired from Denmark to work in Greenland, you got the best apartments. You got the ones with the views, the ones that were recently renovated, and you paid a fraction of the cost, or sometimes nothing at all. If you were a local Greenlander, you were put on a waiting list, a list that could be 10 to 15 years long. Even today, in 2026, the housing crisis in Nuuk is catastrophic. You have young people sleeping on friends' couches for years because they can't find a place to live. You have families crammed into one-room dorms. Meanwhile, private developers are building luxury apartments with glass facades that overlook the fjord, selling for millions of kroner. Who buys them? Mostly foreign investors, mining executives, and the wealthy elite. It is a tale of two cities. On one side, you have the Lego land of colourful, expensive new builds. On the other side, you have the decaying concrete blocks from the 60s and 70s, still filled with people who were promised a modern life, but were given a slum. In 2012, the Greenlandic government finally decided to tear down Block P. It was a massive event. Crowds gathered to watch the demolition. People cheered as the excavator claws ripped into the concrete. It was supposed to be a symbolic moment, the end of the colonial era, the end of the experiment. But here is the dark irony. They tore it down, but they didn't have enough houses to replace it. The people who lived there were just scattered to other, equally overcrowded buildings. The problem wasn't the concrete, it was the policy. The concrete blocks era taught Greenland a hard lesson. You cannot copy-paste a society. You cannot take a culture that is deeply connected to the land, the weather and the silence, and force it into a standardized European box. When you try, the walls start to close in. And speaking of the environment fighting back, the concrete blocks aren't the only things cracking in Greenland. The very foundation of the island, the ice sheet itself, is starting to shatter. And when this ice goes, it's not just Greenland's problem. It's going to be a problem for anyone with a zip code near the ocean. Let's talk about the albedo effect, and why Greenland holds the kill switch for Miami, New York, and Shanghai. 9. Climate 0. When the ice sheet breaks. If you're standing on the edge of the Greenland ice sheet in the summer of 2025, you don't just see the melt. You hear it. It sounds like a jet engine idling in the distance. It's the roar of Mulan rivers, massive torrents of bright blue meltwater plunging thousands of feet straight down into the belly of the glacier. To the naked eye, the ice sheet looks eternal. It covers 80% of the island. It is 3 times the size of Texas, and in some places 2 miles thick. It holds enough fresh water to fill the Great Lakes 100 times over. But here is the dark reality that scientists are screaming about. This ice is not a fortress. It is a fragile, dying animal, and it has a kill switch for the rest of the world. Let's talk about the science without getting boring. It comes down to something called the albedo effect. Think of it like wearing a t-shirt on a hot day. If you wear a white t-shirt, you stay cool because white reflects the sun. If you wear a black t-shirt, you roast because black absorbs the heat. For thousands of years, Greenland was wearing a pristine white t-shirt. But now, as the climate warms, the snow melts and reveals the darker, older ice underneath. It also creates pools of deep blue water. Darker ice plus blue water, more heat absorption, more melting. It is a feedback loop from hell. The more it melts, the faster it melts, and the numbers are absolutely terrifying. A report released just last year in 2025 confirmed that the Greenland ice sheet is currently losing roughly 30 million tons of ice per hour. Per hour. That is not a typo. every 60 minutes, another 30 million tons of water pours into the Atlantic Ocean. But the real horror story isn't the daily melt, it's the zombie ice. In late 2022, a groundbreaking study dropped a bombshell that we are still processing. Scientists analysed the equilibrium of the ice sheet and found that we have already crossed a point of no return. They calculated that no matter what we do, even if we stopped all carbon emissions tomorrow and everyone started driving bicycles made of hemp, Greenland is locked in to lose roughly 110 trillion tons of ice. They call it zombie ice because it is technically still attached to the glacier, but it is dead. It is doomed. It is no longer being fed by snowpack. It is just waiting to melt. This dead ice alone guarantees that global sea levels will rise by at least 10 inches, 27 centimetres. That might not sound like much, but when you add in storm surges and high tides, that is enough to make parts of Miami, Bangladesh and the Marshall Islands uninhabitable. And that is the minimum. That is the optimistic scenario. If the entire ice sheet were to melt, if we hit the runaway tipping point, 7.2 metres, that is 24 feet of global sea level rise. Goodbye, Florida. Goodbye, Netherlands. Goodbye, Shanghai. Goodbye, Lower Manhattan. This is why Greenland is ground zero for the global climate crisis. It is the canary in the coal mine, but the canary is the size of a continent and it's holding a detonator. But while the rest of the world worries about their beachfront property, the people living in Greenland are facing a different kind of apocalypse. For the Inuit, the ice isn't just a climate statistic. It is their highway. It is their supermarket. It is their soul. In the north, hunters use the sea ice to travel by dog sled to hunt seals and fish. But the ice is becoming unpredictable. It is thinning. We are seeing tragic stories of experienced hunters, men who have read the ice their entire lives, falling through and drowning because the ice behaved in a way it never has before. The seasons are broken. It rains in January. The snow comes too late. The sled dogs, which we will talk about soon, are becoming expensive burdens because the sledding season is shrinking. And then there is the landslides. As the permafrost melts, the mountains are literally falling apart. In 2017, a massive landslide in the Kvanefjeld triggered a tsunami that wiped out the village of Nuugaatsiaq. Houses were swept into the sea. 4 people died. The risk was so high that the government had to permanently evacuate a nearby village. Think about that. Climate change isn't a future threat in Greenland. It is already creating climate refugees inside the country. This is the psychological weight of the climate zero reality. The people of Greenland know that their home is the engine of a global disaster. They watch the diplomats and scientists fly in on private jets to study the melt, shake their heads, and fly home while the locals are left to navigate a landscape that is trying to kill them. So when you hear about the strategic value of Greenland, remember that its most potent weapon isn't a missile silo or a rare earth mine, it is the water itself. And speaking of liquids that are destroying the country, while the ice melts outside, there is another flood happening inside the homes of many Greenlanders. It's a crisis that has been fueled by trauma, colonization and despair. Let's talk about the bottle. 10. The alcohol epidemic and prohibition. If you walk into a supermarket in Nuuk on a Saturday afternoon at 1:05 p.m, you might witness a strange phenomenon. You will see people rushing to the checkout counters, clutching 6-packs of Tuborg or bottles of wine like their lives depend on it. And then, at exactly 1:00 p.m, or depending on the specific local municipality's current rule, a literal or metaphorical iron curtain comes down. The alcohol section is cordoned off. The lights in the beer coolers turn off. If you try to buy a beer at 1:15 p.m, the cashier will look at you like you're trying to buy plutonium. Closed, they will say. This isn't because the shopkeepers are lazy. It is because the government of Greenland is fighting a desperate war against a liquid enemy that has arguably done more damage to the population than any climate shift or colonial decree. Welcome to the alcohol epidemic. To understand why buying a beer in Greenland is so complicated, you have to go back to the beginning. Before the Europeans arrived, the Inuit had no alcohol. None. Their drugs were adrenaline from the hunt, and maybe some fermented meat, but they didn't ferment grain or fruit for intoxication. When the whalers and Danish colonizers arrived in the 1700s, they brought firewater, but for a long time access was strictly controlled. The Danes treated the Inuit like children who couldn't be trusted with a bottle. But then came the 1950s, the era of modernization and equal rights. In 1954, in the spirit of making Greenlanders equal to Danes, the colonial administration abolished alcohol rationing. They said, "You are modern citizens now, you can drink like us." It was a disaster. You have to remember the context. This was happening at the exact same time as the G60 forced relocations. You had thousands of men who had just lost their sled dogs, their hunting grounds, and their purpose, now sitting in concrete apartments with nothing to do. And suddenly they had unlimited access to cheap, strong liquor. The result was an explosion of consumption. By the 1980s, alcohol consumption in Greenland had peaked at 22 litres of pure alcohol per person per year. That is double what it was in Denmark. It was one of the highest rates in the world. Greenland didn't develop a glass of wine with dinner culture. It developed a drink until you black out to forget the pain culture. The statistics from this era are horrific. In the 80s and 90s, alcohol was involved in the vast majority of homicides, suicides, and sexual assaults. A generation of children grew up in homes where weekends were terrifying events. They learned to fear the sound of a bottle opening. This trauma created a ripple effect that the country is still drowning in. Today, while the average consumption per person has actually dropped to be lower than in Denmark, the pattern of drinking is still dangerous. It's binge or bust. The government has tried everything. They tried reintroducing rationing in the late 70s. It created a black market. They tried high taxes. People just spent their food money on booze. They tried banning it entirely in certain villages. It led to homebrewing of dangerous mash. Currently, the strategy is strict access control. In many towns, you cannot buy alcohol after 6 p.m. on weekdays. On Saturdays, sales often stop at 1 p.m. On Sundays, forget about it. During the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, the government took the nuclear option. They completely banned the sale of alcohol in the capital Nuuk. Why? Not to stop the virus, to protect the children. The Prime Minister at the time, Kim Kielsen, was blunt. He said the ban was necessary because with schools closed, children were stuck at home with abusive drunk parents. He literally said, "Every child has the right to a safe home." Think about how dark that reality is. The government had to enforce a prohibition just to ensure kids wouldn't be beaten or neglected during a lockdown. And then there is the white curtain. In recent years, some stores have been ordered to physically hide alcohol behind white curtains or frosted glass. The logic is out of sight, out of mind. If you don't see the beer, maybe you won't buy it. It feels dystopian. You are walking through a modern supermarket with fresh fruit and diapers, and then there is this shameful hidden section like it's an adult video store. The locals are divided. Many see these restrictions as necessary to save lives, but others, especially the younger generation and the moderates, see it as patronising. They argue, "Why are you treating us like children? I just want a bottle of wine for my anniversary." It brings up the old colonial wound. The state doesn't trust you. So when you see a tourist laughing about how expensive a beer is in Greenland, or complaining about the weird opening hours, they are usually missing the point. Those high prices and locked cabinets aren't there to annoy tourists. They are there to stop a grandmother from burying another grandchild. But even if you stay sober, life in Greenland has another challenge that makes simple things, like visiting your family in the next town, almost impossible. Imagine living in a country the size of Western Europe, but you can't drive from one city to another. Let's talk about the logistical insanity of Greenland's infrastructure. 11. Infrastructure. Hell. No roads between towns. Let's play a game. Open Google Maps and look at Greenland. Zoom into the capital Nuuk. Now, look for the road that leads to the next biggest town, Sisimiut. Spoiler alert, you won't find one. There are no roads between towns in Greenland, none. Zero. This is the only country in the world where you can't get in a car and drive to your neighbour's city. The road network in Nuuk basically consists of a few loops around the city centre, a road to the airport and a road to a dead-end view of a fjord. If you drive for 15 minutes in any direction, you run out of asphalt and hit a wall of rock or ice. This isn't because they forgot to pave them. It's because building roads in Greenland is a logistical nightmare that makes the pyramids look like a Lego set. You have deep fjords cutting into the land every few miles. You have mountains that shoot straight up from the sea. You have permafrost that turns the ground into a shifting sponge in the summer. To connect just two towns, you would need to build dozens of suspension bridges and tunnel through miles of granite. It would cost billions. So how do people get around? They fly. But this isn't like hopping on a Southwest flight from Vegas to LA. Air Greenland has a monopoly, and they know it. The backbone of the country is the Dash 8, a rugged red propeller plane that can land on short, icy runways. But the prices? They are extortionate. A round-trip ticket between Nuuk and Ilulissat, a 45-minute flight, can cost as much as a round-trip ticket from New York to London. We're talking $600 to $1,000 for a domestic hop. Imagine if you lived in Chicago and it cost you $800 to visit your mum in Detroit. You just wouldn't go. This creates a profound sense of isolation. Families are separated not by distance, but by price. You have grandparents who haven't seen their grandkids in years, even though they live in the same country simply because they can't afford the airfare. There is a cheaper option, the Safak Ituk ferry. It's a coastal ship that chugs up and down the west coast. It's the Greyhound bus of the sea. It's scenic, sure, but it's slow. To get from Nuuk to Ilulissat takes nearly 2 days, and in the winter, when the sea ice creeps in and the storms hit, the ferry doesn't run. If the weather is bad, and in Greenland the weather is always bad, the entire country shuts down. No planes, no boats, you're stuck where you are. This infrastructure hell has a massive impact on the economy. How can you build a business if you can't ship goods cheaply? A tomato in Greenland cost a fortune because it had to be flown in or shipped on a weeks-long journey from Denmark. Construction costs are insane because every bag of cement, every plank of wood and every nail has to be imported. But recently this infrastructure problem has become part of the geopolitical game we talked about earlier. A few years ago, Greenland decided it needed bigger airports. They wanted international flights to land directly in Nuuk and Ilulissat, bypassing the current hub in Kangerlussuaq, a former US military base in the middle of nowhere. They needed money to build them. Who raised their hand? China. A Chinese construction giant offered to build the airports. This set off alarm bells in Washington, D.C. and Copenhagen. They panicked. They saw a future where Chinese jets controlled the runways of the Arctic. So the US and Denmark essentially swooped in and said, no, we'll pay for it. Denmark provided a massive loan, and the US offered technical assistance, forcing Greenland to reject the Chinese bid. The new airports are being built right now. You can see the massive blasting operations if you visit Nuuk today. They are scheduled to open fully by late 2025 or 2026. They promise to lower ticket prices and bring in tourists. But many locals are skeptical. They worry it will just bring mass tourism that will overrun their small towns, turning Nuuk into an Arctic Venice, while the locals are pushed out by Airbnb prices. The lack of roads is a symbol of Greenland's reality. You are at the mercy of the elements. You're not the master of this land. You're a guest. And if the wind blows from the east at 60 miles per hour, you aren't going anywhere, no matter how rich or powerful you are. But while the humans are stuck on the tarmac waiting for the fog to clear, there is another group of residents who are facing a much more permanent removal. They are the icons of the Arctic. They are the engines of the Inuit culture, and they are disappearing at a rate that is terrifying. Let's talk about the sled dog Cull. 12. The dog sled, Cull, and modernization. If you travel to the town of Ilulissat today and walk to the edge of the city, you will hear a sound that raises the hair on the back of your neck. It's a low, guttural, collective howl that echoes off the icebergs. It's the sound of the Greenland sled dog, or Kimmet. To the uninitiated, it sounds like a wolf pack. And honestly, it's not far off. These aren't golden retrievers. They aren't pets. You don't pet them, you don't play fetch with them, and you definitely don't let them sleep in your bed. They are working animals, genetically distinct biological machines that have been engineered by 4,000 years of survival of the fittest to pull heavy loads across the frozen ocean. For millennia, the dog was the most important technology the Inuit possessed. Without the dog, there was no hunting. Without the dog, there was no travel. Without the dog, you died. The bond between the hunter and his team was sacred. It was a partnership of survival. But if you talk to the elders in North Greenland today, they will tell you a story that makes the G60 housing crisis look almost benign. They will tell you about the time the authorities tried to kill their culture by killing their dogs. This is the controversy of the sled dog Cull. Go back to the 1950s and 60s. The Danish administration is pushing hard for modernization. They want the Inuit off the land and into the towns. They want them to stop being nomadic hunters and start being stationary workers. According to the memories of countless locals, the police began a systematic campaign of shooting sled dogs. The official story from the authorities was health and safety. They claimed there were rabies outbreaks. They claimed that loose dogs in the growing towns were biting children and posing a danger to the public. They introduced strict laws. Dogs had to be chained up. If a dog was found loose, bang. But the hunters saw it differently. To them, it felt like a calculated tactical strike. Imagine you're a hunter living in a settlement. You wake up one morning to the sound of gunshots. You run outside and see the police shooting your team, your engine, your livelihood, your best friends. Without your dogs, you are grounded. You can't get to the breathing holes to hunt seals. You can't travel to the next village. You're stranded. And where do you have to go when you can't hunt? You have to move to the town. You have to get a job at the fish factory. You have to move into the concrete block. Many Inuit believe to this day that the dog killings were a deliberate strategy to force them into the modern economy. Cut the legs off the hunter, and he becomes a worker. A few years ago, the anger over this became so loud that the Danish and Greenlandic governments set up a commission to investigate. In 2021, the report was released. It concluded that while there was no written master plan found in the archives to exterminate the dogs for social engineering, the authorities had been ruthless, culturally insensitive, and overly aggressive in enforcing the rules. The report apologised for the trauma, but it stopped short of calling it a conspiracy. For many elders, that apology felt hollow. They know what they saw. They know that when the dogs died, a part of their soul died with them. But the tragedy of the Greenland dog didn't end in the 60s. The decline is happening right now, faster than ever before. In roughly 20 years, the population of sled dogs in Greenland has plummeted from around 30,000 to fewer than 12,000. Why? Two reasons: economics and climate change. First, the snowmobile. In the 1980s and 90s, the Ski-Doo started to replace the dog team. It's faster. You don't have to feed it when you aren't using it. You don't have to shovel its poop. For a modern hunter trying to make a living, a snowmobile makes economic sense. But a snowmobile has no soul. A snowmobile can't smell a seal breathing whole from a mile away. A snowmobile can't sense thin ice and refuse to move, saving your life. A snowmobile can't navigate you home in a whiteout blizzard by instinct. When a snowmobile breaks down, you freeze. When a dog team stops, you can cuddle with them for warmth, in an emergency. But the biggest killer of the dogs today is the melting ice. As we discussed, the sea ice is shrinking. The season for sledding used to be 6 or 7 months. Now in some places it's 3 months, maybe 2. If you can only use your dogs for 8 weeks a year, can you afford to feed a team of 12 hungry animals for the other 10 months? Dog food, usually imported dry food or seal meat, is expensive. Hunters are facing a heartbreaking choice. They can't afford the dogs anymore. We're hearing horror stories of hunters who have to take their entire team out behind the hill and shoot them because they simply cannot feed them. Grown men, tough as nails, weeping as they put down the lineage they have raised for decades. It is an extinction of a way of life. The government is trying to save the breed. They have banned the import of other dog breeds above the Arctic Circle to keep the bloodline pure. They are subsidising dog food. They are trying to promote dog sled tourism as a way for mushers to make money. But the trend line is brutal. If the ice disappears, the dog has no purpose. And if the dog disappears, the Inuit lose their last connection to the old world. There is a saying in Greenland: a man without dogs is just a man. A man with dogs is a king. Today, there are fewer kings in the north. The howling is getting quieter every winter. And as the traditional economy collapses, Greenland is looking for a new lifeline. They want out of the colonial shadow. They want to stand on their own 2 feet. But there is a massive billion-dollar elephant in the room. Greenland wants independence. They want to break free from Denmark. But there is a price tag attached to freedom. And right now, they can't pay it. Let's talk about the block grant, and why the dream of the 51st state might actually look appealing to some people when they check the bank account. 13. Independence versus the block grant. If you walk into any pub in Nuuk and ask a local, "Do you want Greenland to be an independent country?" you'll hear a strong yes from many people. The dream of sovereignty is alive and well. The Greenlandic flag, that fierce red and white sun rising over ice and sea, is flown with pride. Many Greenlanders are tired of asking Copenhagen for permission. They're wary of the colonial legacy we discussed earlier. They want to be masters of their own house. But then, if you ask the same person, "Should we declare independence tomorrow?" the room often gets quiet. Because there's a ghost in the room, a very expensive ghost. It's called the Block Grant, Block till Skudet. Here's the cold, hard math. Every year, the Kingdom of Denmark sends a substantial sum of money to Greenland's government, roughly 3.9 to 4 or so billion Danish kroner, about $600 million USD. That might sound like a rounding error to a superpower that can spend that much on office furniture for the Pentagon. But for Greenland, that funding is life support. That grant covers more than half of the public budget. It helps pay doctors' salaries, teachers' wages, airport operations and essential services. It literally keeps the lights on in towns separated by hundreds of miles of ice and fjord. Without it, the standard of living in Greenland would face a deep contraction. Perhaps not instant collapse, but severe economic stress. This creates the ultimate golden handcuffs scenario. Greenland is legally free to pursue independence. The 2009 Self-Government Act acknowledges that right, but the economic foundations for doing so simply aren't there yet. If the block grant disappeared, Greenland would need alternative revenue streams before it could sustain full sovereignty. Enter the idea floated by some US policymakers. While the international reaction focused on the 2019 tweet about buying Greenland, strategic planners in Washington have quietly considered other approaches. Some analysts have speculated about model arrangements inspired by the US Compact of Free Association, COFA, like those with Palau, the Federated States of Micronesia, and the Marshall Islands, which combine financial assistance with defense partnerships. That remains hypothetical, not official US policy. For fans of independence, such an offer might look tempting, a way to finally cut the cord with Copenhagen while replacing Danish funding with American support. But for many Greenlanders, it also looks like jumping out of the frying pan and into the fire. The concern sharpened dramatically after the January 2026 US military operation in Venezuela, where American forces captured President Nicolas Maduro and transferred him to US custody. For supporters of hard power in Washington, the operation demonstrated resolve. For smaller nations watching from the sidelines, it sent a different message. When the United States decides something is a strategic priority, it is willing to act unilaterally and decisively. To critics in Greenland, that raises an uncomfortable question. If the island swaps the Danish block grant for an American security guarantee and subsidy, is that real independence or simply a change of patron? Denmark can sometimes feel like a condescending guardian, slow to change, quick to lecture. But many Greenlanders still retain broad autonomy over their domestic life. The fear is that a deeper US alignment could steer the country toward a resource and military-dependent future, rather than one built on sustainable fishing, tourism, and locally driven development. That is the dark reality of the Arctic political landscape in 2026. The idea of Greenland as America's 51st state isn't just a meme anymore, it's a tangible economic and strategic conversation happening in real time. And while politicians argue over who pays the bills, there's a warning buried deep in this island's history. Over 1,000 years ago, Norse settlers built farms and churches in Greenland. They adapted and survived for generations, until their settlements eventually faded from the historical record under conditions historians and archaeologists still debate. Whether it was climate, economics, isolation, or all three, the lesson remains: respect the land, respect the limits, and never assume power guarantees permanence. 14. The mystery of the lost Vikings. If you take a boat deep into the Volsey Fjord in southern Greenland, you will find something that shouldn't be there. Standing in the middle of the empty, windswept grass is a stone church. It's not a ruin from the 1900s, it's a medieval European cathedral, built from massive granite blocks. It has stood there for centuries, staring out at the fjord, completely silent. This is the last resting place of the Norse Greenlanders. You see, long before the US Air Force or the Danish kings arrived, Greenland was the home of the Vikings, and their story is the ultimate horror movie about what happens when you try to fight the Arctic and lose. It started with a lie. Around the year 985 AD, an exiled Viking named Eric the Red sailed west from Iceland. He found this massive icy island. He wanted to start a colony, but he knew that nobody would want to move to a place called Iceland too. So he pulled off the greatest real estate marketing scam in history. He named it Grunland, Greenland. He told the folks back in Iceland, "Hey, it's super green. The pastures are amazing, come on over." And it worked. Thousands of settlers followed him. They established two main colonies, the Eastern Settlement and the Western settlement. For nearly 500 years, longer than the United States has existed as a country, they thrived. They built churches with stained glass. They had bishops sent from Rome. They paid their tithes in walrus ivory and polar bear furs, which were luxury goods in Europe. They had cows, sheep and goats. They lived a European life on the edge of the known world. And then, in the 15th century, they just vanished. The last written record we have is a wedding in Wolsey Church in 1408. After that, silence. When a ship finally arrived from Norway in the early 1700s, hoping to reconnect with the lost colony, they found nothing but ghosts. The houses were standing, but the roofs had caved in. The fields were empty. There were no bodies, no mass graves, no signs of a massacre. Just emptiness. For centuries, this was the biggest mystery in archaeology. Did they pack up and leave? Were they abducted by aliens? Did they all die of plague? But modern science, digging through trash heaps and analysing ancient ice cores, has revealed the dark truth. The Vikings weren't murdered. They were stubborn. Around the year 1300, the climate began to shift. The medieval warm period ended, and the Little Ice Age began. The temperatures dropped. The sea ice expanded, cutting off the trade routes to Europe. The summers got shorter. The hay for the cows wouldn't grow. The Vikings were facing starvation. But here is the tragic part. They were surrounded by food. The waters were teeming with ringed seals and fish. The Inuit, the Thule culture, who had arrived in Greenland around the year 1200, were doing just fine. They were thriving because they knew how to hunt whales, use toggle harpoons, and wear tailored fur clothing that was waterproof. The Vikings could have learned from them. They could have adopted the kayak. They could have started eating more seal. But they didn't. They refused to become Inuit. To them, the Inuit were Skraelings, wretched people. The Vikings viewed themselves as civilized Christian Europeans, and civilized Europeans eat beef, not seal. Archaeologists looking at the bones of the last Vikings found signs of severe malnutrition. They were slowly starving to death, clinging to their European identity, while their neighbours were feasting a few miles away. They ate their cows, then they ate their dogs. Some evidence suggests they might have even eaten the hunting falcons, and finally they just died out, huddled in their stone houses, freezing to death in wool clothes that were useless against the Arctic wind. It is a brutal lesson in adaptability. The Norse extinction proves that technology and civilization don't mean anything if you don't respect the environment. The Vikings thought they could impose their will on Greenland. They thought they could be farmers in a land of hunters. Greenland chewed them up and spit them out. This is the warning for the 51st state narrative. The Americans and Danes today come with their heated airports and their container ships, thinking they have conquered the island. They think their supply chains are invincible. But the ghost of Eric the Red is whispering from the ruins of Wolsey. The climate changes fast, the ships stop coming, and if you don't know how to survive on the land's terms, you're just a temporary tenant. But unlike the Vikings, the modern world has one advantage: global trade. And as the ice melts, Greenland isn't just a dead end anymore, it's becoming a highway. For the final chapter of our dark reality, we have to look at the map of the future. The ice is clearing, and the ships are coming, but this time they aren't bringing settlers, they are bringing the entire global economy. Let's talk about the Arctic Silk Road. 15. The Arctic Silk Road. Future trade routes. For the last 500 years, if you wanted to ship a container of iPhones from Shanghai to Rotterdam, you had to take the long way around. You went south through the Strait of Malacca, across the Indian Ocean, up the Red Sea, and through the Suez Canal. It's roughly an 11,000, 12,000 mile journey that typically takes 35 to 45 days. But the planet is changing. As the Arctic heats up and the ice retreats, a new path is opening at the top of the world. They call it the Polar Silk Road. There are two main routes, the Northeast Passage along Russia's coast and the Northwest Passage through the Canadian Arctic near Greenland. In favourable seasons, these routes can shave 10 to 15 days off shipping times as nearly a 30-40% reduction. In global logistics, that kind of time savings translates into billions of dollars in fuel, labour and inventory costs. Suddenly, Greenland isn't just sitting at the edge of the map anymore, it's positioned near what could become one of the world's most strategically important shipping corridors. Some planners imagine a future where Nuuk functions like a Singapore of the North, deep-water ports servicing massive cargo vessels, refueling hubs for transpolar traffic, logistic zones feeding Europe and North America. It's a vision of Arctic globalization. This is why China officially labelled itself a near-Arctic state in 2018, even though its northernmost territory lies nearly 900 miles south of the Arctic Circle. Beijing sees the long game. Whoever shapes Arctic ports, infrastructure and access rules will influence the toll booth of tomorrow's trade routes. But here's the darker side of the Arctic Silk Road. The Arctic ecosystem is brutally fragile. A grounded ship in the Suez Canal is an inconvenience. A tanker spill in the Northwest Passage could be an ecological disaster lasting generations. Oil degrades extremely slowly in freezing water. It becomes trapped beneath ice, coats seabirds and marine mammals, and disrupts the base of the food chain: plankton, fish, seals, whales. Cleanup operations are limited by weather, darkness, ice cover, and sheer remoteness. There are few nearby ports capable of rapid emergency response. Search and rescue infrastructure is thin. Several recent near-groundings and emergency evacuations in polar waters have already shown how narrow the margin for error really is. Industrializing the Arctic means turning one of Earth's last great wilderness regions into a high-speed commercial corridor, and for Greenlanders, the risk is becoming spectators in their own homeland. Ports could be automated, owned by foreign investors, staffed by imported labour. Greenland absorbs the environmental risk, distant shareholders collect the profits. So when you look at Greenland on a map, don't just see ice, see a chessboard. The pieces are moving, the ice is melting, and the game is only beginning. 16. Final thoughts. So let's go back to the question we started with. Can the United States buy Greenland? Technically, maybe. With enough money, enough pressure, and the current geopolitical climate, almost anything becomes possible. The idea of a 51st state sounds like a joke today. But history has a way of moving faster than people expect. But the dark reality of Greenland is this: it cannot be bought without inheriting the ghosts that live in the ice. If you buy Greenland, you inherit the buried contamination of Camp Century. You inherit the trauma of the experiment children and the forced displacement around Thule. You inherit one of the highest suicide rates in the world. You inherit a massive ice sheet whose melting contributes directly to rising sea levels that threaten coastlines far beyond the Arctic, including your own. Greenland is not just a strategic asset or a real estate deal. It is a people and a society of survivors, a population that has endured colonization, forced modernization, cultural disruption, and accelerating climate change. And yet they are still here. They still hunt. They still speak their language. They still defend their identity. The uncomfortable truth is that the world wants Greenland primarily for what it has: minerals, shipping routes, strategic positioning, fresh water. Far more than for who lives there. As the ice melts and the great powers circle like sharks, Greenland's people face their hardest challenge yet: not survival against cold, but survival against erasure in a warming, greedy world. So the next time you see a headline about buying Greenland, remember, the real price tag is much higher than dollars. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the frozen unknown, hit that subscribe button. We've got more dark geography and hidden history coming your way. And let me know in the comments, do you think Greenland will be independent in 10 years, or living under the influence of a superpower? Thanks for watching, stay warm.